Anthropogenic global warming perspective. This perspective emphasizes that human activities, like burning fossil fuels, are the main cause of Earth's observed warming. Climate skepticism perspective. This view questions how much humans contribute to climate change, suggesting that natural factors play a bigger role. Climate justice perspective. This perspective focuses on how climate change affects different communities, pushing for fairness in addressing the crisis. Climate adaptation perspective. This perspective looks at ways to adapt communities and ecosystems to the unavoidable impacts of climate change. Climate mitigation perspective. This perspective supports actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to slow down climate change. Climate engineering perspective. This perspective explores technological solutions to manipulate the climate, like reflecting sunlight away from Earth. Climate fatalism perspective. This perspective sees climate change as inevitable, with humanity facing catastrophic consequences. Climate economics perspective. This perspective studies the economic costs and benefits of climate change and the policies needed to manage them. Climate ethics perspective. This perspective looks at ethical issues related to climate change, such as fairness between generations and countries. Environmental conservation perspective. This perspective focuses on protecting nature to reduce the impact of climate change. Renewable energy transition perspective. This perspective promotes switching to renewable energy sources to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Sustainable development perspective. This perspective advocates for development that meets current needs without compromising future generations. Resilience and vulnerability perspective. This perspective examines how communities and ecosystems can adapt to climate change and how they're affected. Localized climate impact perspective. This perspective studies the specific effects of climate change on local communities and ecosystems. Global governance perspective. This perspective emphasizes the need for international cooperation to address climate change. Cultural and Indigenous knowledge perspective. This perspective values Indigenous knowledge and cultural practices in understanding and addressing climate change. Health and well-being perspective. This perspective looks at the health impacts of climate change, like increased diseases and heat-related illnesses. Technological optimism perspective. This perspective believes that technology can provide solutions to climate change challenges, like developing clean energy technologies. Environmental degradation perspective. This perspective highlights the harmful effects of human activities on the environment, worsened by climate change. Environmental justice perspective. This perspective advocates for fair distribution of environmental burdens and benefits, focusing on marginalized communities affected by climate change. Human security perspective. This perspective focuses on the security implications of climate change, such as migration and conflicts over resources. Climate migration perspective. This perspective explores how climate change influences migration patterns, like people being forced to leave their homes due to rising sea levels. Climate refugees perspective. This perspective focuses on people forced to leave their homes due to climate change and the protection of their rights under international law. Climate diplomacy perspective. This perspective looks at the role of diplomacy and international negotiations in addressing climate change and achieving global climate goals. Climate policy perspective. This perspective analyzes the development, implementation, and effectiveness of policies to address climate change. Climate communication perspective. This perspective focuses on effective communication strategies to raise awareness about climate change and mobilize action. Climate education perspective. This perspective emphasizes the importance of educating the public and policymakers about climate change. Climate awareness perspective. This perspective aims to increase awareness of climate change and the urgency to take action through campaigns and educational programs. Climate psychology perspective. This perspective studies the psychological and behavioral aspects of climate change, like responses to threats and motivations for action. Climate action perspective. This perspective advocates for individual and collective action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. Climate resilience perspective. This perspective focuses on building resilient communities and ecosystems capable of adapting to the inevitable impacts of climate change. Climate justice advocacy perspective. This perspective pushes for policy changes and societal shifts to address climate change in a fair manner for all involved. Indigenous rights and sovereignty perspective. This perspective emphasizes the protection of indigenous rights and land rights in addressing climate change. Climate science denial perspective. This perspective challenges the scientific consensus on climate change, hindering effective policy action. Climate change impacts on biodiversity perspective. This perspective examines how climate change affects biodiversity, such as habitat changes and species extinction. Ocean acidification perspective. This perspective focuses on the acidification of the oceans due to increased levels of absorbed carbon dioxide and its consequences for marine ecosystems. Climate change and food security perspective. This perspective explores the impact of climate change on global food production and the challenges of ensuring food security in a changing climate. Climate change and conflict perspective. This perspective examines the relationship between climate change and armed conflicts, like disputes over natural resources and forced migration due to climate-related stress. Climate change and human rights perspective. This perspective focuses on the impact of climate change on human rights, such as the right to life, food, water, and a healthy environment.